Well, let's jump in and talk about death. So I want to begin by kind of reviewing. So the first week, if you remember, I kind of set up why this is of interest to me and some of my history, and then I was left with all kinds of questions about, well, if the Bible teaches this about death, why this, why this? And I think I told you about when I was a student at Harding University, and they were talking about the Sadducees, how they don't believe in an afterlife. And I'm, what? That blew me away, right? And thought about, well, if we all die, what's the purpose of life? What is it I'm trying to accomplish if everybody dies? And then one of my questions was, all right, so if when I die, I go to heaven, what's this whole thing about a resurrection? I come and get my body and go back to heaven. That didn't make any sense to me. So I had all these kinds of questions. And I had books or professors saying, so here, if you remember we talked about, we learn something, and that's our belief, our orientation on life, and then we start to see, wait a second, something's not making sense. We start to see problems with that theory, and we start to challenge it until eventually we learn a new understanding. And often these have similarities but differences. And I was like, okay, I get it, there's something wrong here, but I don't understand what they're teaching me. So that was the first week. And then last week, we looked at, all right, let's go back to Genesis and see what it says. And we saw the two creation stories, and that God created the earth upon which mankind would live as God's image bearer, that we are to carry, we're God's representative, we're God's assistant, we might say, kind of working in the world. And that God walked on the earth with man. He gave two commandments, that is, we're to care for the earth and we're to multiply. And we saw that as long as man had access to the tree of life, he would live. But when he disobeyed gaining the knowledge of good and evil, whatever that symbolizes, God then removed man's access to the tree of life. And we talked about how the Greeks believed that the physical world is corrupted and flawed, and it cannot get any better. It's corrupted and flawed at a fundamental level, where the Hebrews said, no, the creation is good at a fundamental level. It's just been polluted, but not, its goodness hasn't gone away. Okay. So, if that's kind of the beginning of where did death come from, then the question is, all right, what happens at death? And to address that, we've got to address another question, and that is man mortal or immortal? So, was man created as immortal, and God took away his immortality, making him mortal? Or was man created as mortal, and he would continue to live as long as he had access to the tree of life, but when that was taken away, his mortality continued? And there's a reason we're going to get into why that's important. Or another part of it is, are some parts of man mortal and other parts immortal? Okay, so that's kind of where we're heading today. Now, to start, I want to kind of look at what did the Greeks believe? And so if we go with Homer, and I'm getting a lot of this out of N.T. Wright's book, The Resurrection of the Son of God. If you've read his book, Surprised by Hope, that's like this for dummies, okay? And even that one you go. I was listening to one of his podcasts, and he said he has a lot of books called Simply Christian, Simply This, Simply That. And he said, his editor said, Tom, I don't think you understand what the word simple means. So, he talks about how for Homer, in his writings, he said, basically, the soul or the spirit, and we'll talk about later about kind of some of those, what exactly is that? That for Homer, the spirit, when it dies, goes to Hades. And the Hades, in their world, was the underworld where the dead are. And it was ruled by the god Hades, right? So Hades, the god, ruled the place Hades. And when people die, their spirit, their ghost goes there, but they are not fully themselves, and they never will be. Okay? So it's kind of a non-existent existence, we might say. And so, remember we talked about continuity and discontinuity and all that. So my understanding is Homer would say, when your body dies, you know, you're dead, and your soul, whether it's soul, spirit, dies, but it's kind of present but not really alive. Think of
somebody on life support.
yeah. Think of, so you remember years ago, gosh, the Promise Keepers for Men. And I remember it was out of the old Texas Stadium, right? And the guy talked about, how many of y'all think you could throw a football from here to here? And of course all the guys, I could do it, right? And then he hands the guy a football, it's deflated, there's no air in it, right? You can't throw a deflated football. I think Homer would say something like, maybe that's what our soul is like. It's there, but it's deflated. It's not doing anything, it's not usable, okay? Okay, and so that was the view, the Greek view, until Plato comes along. And Plato believed in his philosophy, as I understand it. So there's kind of the world of the mind, the soul, and then there's the material world. And the mind-soul world is perfect, and the physical world is a poor imitation of it, right? And so think of it like, if you're going to build a chair, you have an image in your mind of what a chair is before you build it. And he would say that's the world of the mind, the spirit. And then when you build the physical chair, that's a representation of what you're thinking, but it's not a very good one, right? It's always flawed. I think that's what he was saying, okay? But Wright brings out something else. Let's see if I can find this in heat. That he recognized there was a political problem with Homer's view. And he says, according to Wright, what he's saying, this is Plato's thinking, how will we ever get people to be good citizens, he asked, to serve in the army, to do their duty to their friends, if their view of the future life is conditioned by epic pictures of gibbering ghosts in a gloomy underworld? So he's saying, okay, Homer, you've taught this, but it creates problems. How do you get people to say, hey, sacrifice for the greater good? Why, right? So Plato, in his philosophy of how the life is, and this comes up with this view, and here's how Wright says it. For Plato, who were the dead for Plato? They were souls who had been released from the temporary embodiment. Where were they? In Hades, but a very different Hades, and for many a much pleasanter one than the Homeric version. What was wrong? Nothing. This was a far better place and condition for them to be. Of course, wicked souls were being punished, but that, though unpleasant for them, was not a bad thing, since it represented the triumph of justice at last. No further solution was needed. So he says that Plato made three major changes. He changed the understanding of the soul, that the soul is the non-material aspect of a human being and is the aspect that really matters. The soul, being immortal, existed before the body and will continue to exist after the body is gone. So Plato says, okay, the soul is not just kind of a part of us, it's the real us. We're just encapsulated in this body. And the soul has always existed in Greek understanding. So, you know, sometimes in the discussions about abortion, you'll hear people say, well, when does the soul enter the body? That's a Plato question, because it assumes the soul existed and came into the body, right? Instead of when did the soul spring into existence, right? And that's just an example of this very subtle way that Plato's thinking kind of comes in, okay? And that the soul always existed, the soul will always exist. The second change he made was in the nature of Hades. Hades, right, in other words, is not a place of gloom, but in principle at least of delight. The reason people do not return from Hades is the life is so good there. They want to stay rather than to return to the world of space, time, and matter. And that he introduced the idea of a judgment. In the Greek understanding, there are three judges that you stand before, and he says, at last, after all the botched earthly attempts at justice, truth will win out and judgment will be just. The virtuous will find themselves sent to the islands of the blessed, and the wicked will be put in Tartarus. Okay, so he says this thing called Hades that Homer says it's just where people, their soul goes and nothing really happens there. Instead, you're actually conscious and you're judged, and there's a good Hades and a bad Hades. Okay, so that's what Plato introduced. Okay, so let me see here. Plato would be more like this. The body dies, but it's just a shell anyway, and the real self that you were continues on in death. Okay? So that's how Plato viewed it versus Homer. Okay, well, why do we care what they said? Well, all of this impacts how we read Scripture. Okay, so now we're going to look at, all right, what did the Israelites believe? And so, I kind of went through and looked at places where it talks about death. And the first one we get, as you know, is Cain and Abel. So Cain kills Abel, and the phrase, the Lord says, what have you done? Listen, your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. Now you are under a curse and driven from the ground which opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood. So that's kind of the euphemism they use for death. The next one that I find is talking about Adam. It just says Adam lived 130 years. He had sons in his own likeness, in his own image. He named him Seth. After Seth was born, lived 800 years altogether. Adam lived a total of 930 years, and then he died. That's just all it says. Doesn't say anything else about him. Okay, he's dead. All right, so then, with Abraham, when God speaks to him, he says, you, however, will go to your ancestors and be in peace and be buried at a good old age. So the idea of the phrase now for death is going to your ancestors, or as he says, gathered to his people. Abraham lived 175 years. Then Abraham breathed his last and died at a good old age, an old man and full of years, and he was gathered to his people. So we start seeing that phrase being used for death, gathered to their people. Okay. Then, yeah.
Were you going to comment on what that phrase means?
No, tell me.
So it's curious because when you look at how starting in Iron Age tombs, we see they're carved into rock, and there's a place where the body is laid and the body decays.
Right.
And then underneath where the bench is or the stone slab where the body would be, there's normally a pit. And they come back a year later,
right,
and the body is decayed and all that's left are the bones, and they basically just take the bones and slide them under into the pile underneath, so they are gathered to their fathers because the ancestors' bones are underneath the bench.
Right, right.
And we have tons of examples of tombs like that with the bones underneath. So it's literally it's a metaphorical phrase. It really has a literal component to it.
Right. Gather the family corpses together.
Yes,
and
they're all piled under the bench.
Yeah, cool. And you say that, think about cemeteries where you see the family plot. You know, it's not, they're still individualized, but kind of that idea of the whole family is buried together.
Right.
Yeah. So, in Genesis 37 now, when Jacob learns about his son Joseph, and he's in tears and all that. So Jacob tore his clothes, put sackcloth on his loins, and mourned for his son many days. Then all of his sons and all his daughters arose to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. He said, "Surely I will go down to Sheol in mourning for my son." So it's the first time we get this word Sheol. And that's the word they use for the place of the dead. Just like the Greeks had Hades, the Hebrews have this word Sheol. Okay? And it's often translated in our Bibles, the pit or the grave. I'm going to go down to the grave. I'm going to die, basically. Okay, so what is Sheol? So if we look in various Psalms where it's used, we start to see how they viewed Sheol. So in Psalm 6, as the writer is feeling like I'm about to die, he's crying out to God, "Turn, O Lord, save my life, deliver me for the sake of your steadfast love. For in death there is no remembrance of you. In Sheol, who can give you praise?" So he's saying, I don't want to die because I can't praise you there. Okay? Then Psalm 88, "For my soul is full of troubles, and my life draws near to Sheol. I am counted among those who go down to the pit. I am like those who have no help, like those forsaken among the dead, like the slain that lie in the grave, like those whom you remember no more, for they are cut off from your hand." "Do you work wonders for the dead? Do the shades rise up to praise you? Is your steadfast love declared in the grave, or your faithfulness in Abaddon? Are your wonders known in the darkness, or your saving help in the land of forgiveness?" So he's crying out, going, "Hey, I can't worship you. I can't do anything if you let me die." So then, okay, 115. "The highest heavens belong to the Lord, but the earth he has given to mankind. It is not the dead who praise the Lord, those who go down to the place of silence. It is we who extol the Lord, both now and forevermore." And then in Isaiah, when Hezekiah is facing death, he says, "For the grave," where there was Sheol, "cannot praise you. Death cannot sing your praise. Those who go down to the pit cannot hope for your faithfulness. The living, they praise you as I'm doing today. Parents tell their children about your faithfulness. Surely it was for my benefit that I suffered such anguish. In your love you kept me from the pit of destruction. You have put all my sins behind my back." So, again, Hezekiah is saying, "Hey, God, I don't want to go there. Nothing happens there. I can't praise you." And then we have the story, remember the story where King Saul, goes to the witch, right? And he wants him to bring up Samuel. And so she does. She kind of tricks her that he's not Saul, he's in disguise. And she brings up Samuel, and Samuel says to Saul, "Why have you disturbed me by bringing me up?" Right? So it's kind of like, hey, I was having a good nap, right? And you disturbed me. And then he says, talking about what's going to happen to him, "Furthermore, the Lord will also hand Israel along with you over to the Philistines. So tomorrow you and your sons will be with me. Indeed, the Lord will hand the army of Israel over to the Philistines." So this idea of, again, when we die, according to what they were saying, you just die, right? And there's no consciousness. So it's probably, I would assume, if I asked for a show of hands in this class, we would all raise our hands, so we'll just assume it. How many of you have had that wonderful experience of a colonoscopy? Right? Yes, right? Well, the first time, I go in, I'm just terrified because I've never been put under. I don't know what's going to happen, right? And I remember the guy said, "Enjoy your nap, Mr. Williams," and that's the last thing I heard, right? Until I heard, "Mr. Williams, you need to wake up," and I'm thinking, leave me alone, right? I just want to sleep. Well, I read an article years ago by an atheist doctor, and it was talking about what happens at death. And he he said it's kind of like when you go under anesthesia. Now this is the atheist view, but I want you to track with me here. That he said, when you're put under, you become an it. All you are is a body. It's functioning, but nobody's home. And that's what he believed happens at death, right? And I thought, that kind of sounds like what they're saying, right? You just go to sleep, and you exist, but you don't exist, right? So that's the imagery I kind of have when I think of what I hear them saying here. Let's see here. Okay, one more. Ecclesiastes 9. So in Ecclesiastes 9 it says, "Go eat your food with gladness and drink your wine with a joyful heart, for God has already approved what you do. Always be clothed in white, and always anoint your head with oil. Enjoy life with your wife, whom you love, all the days of this meaningless life that God has given you under the sun, all your meaningless days. For this is your lot in life, and in your toilsome labor under the sun. Whatever your hand finds to do, do it with all your might. From the realm of the dead, the Sheol, where you are going, there's neither working, nor planning, nor knowledge, nor wisdom." So that was their view, right? When you die, you're dead. There's no conscious afterlife. Years ago, I had a friend in a church I worked with in California. He said, when Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead, do you think Lazarus was mad about that? Well, that's assuming this, we'll get into kind of New Testament / Greek view that when you die, you go off to heaven, and so to be raised back to life, why would you want that? That's terrible, right? But I don't think that's how Mary and Martha thought. They would think our brother died and he's dead, and to come back to life would be a good thing. Right? Now we'll kind of talk about New Testament later down. But again, it's that idea where we read into Scripture our assumptions, and then we're left with these kind of crazy questions. Okay, so if they don't believe in an afterlife, if you remember my question in Harding, so why be good? Okay, well, for them, they understood what a professor I had called simple retribution. You do good, you'll be rewarded in this life. You do bad, you'll be cursed in this life. And that's what God seems to have told them. In Deuteronomy, he says, "These are the commands, decrees, and laws the Lord your God directed me to teach you to observe in the land you are crossing the Jordan to possess, so that you, your children, and their children after them, may fear the Lord your God as long as you live by keeping all his decrees and commands that I give you, and so that you may enjoy long life. Hear, Israel, and be careful to obey, so that it may go well with you, and that you may increase greatly in a land flowing with milk and honey, just as the Lord, the God of your ancestors, promised you." And later he says, "See, I am setting before you today a blessing and a curse. The blessing, if you obey the commands of the Lord your God that I'm giving you today. The curse, if you disobey the commands of God, turn from the way that I command you today by following another God." So for them, it was about you obey God so you have a good life on earth. Okay? So here's the key point. The Israelites obeyed God not for reward in the next life. There is no next life. They obeyed God so their lives would be good in this life and only this life. Okay, so I want to hear your thoughts, because I don't know if this is something that Jess and Rob have taught, and y'all went, "Yeah, why are you wasting our time? We've already heard this." Or is this something new, or what questions does it stir up for you? Anything at all that pops up for you?
One thing that occurred to me when you were showing the passages from Genesis, that you did not include the reference in chapter 2 where the command that if you partake of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you will surely die. And it occurred to me that they had no reference, Adam and Eve, of what that meant.
Mm. Right? What
I mean,
what does die mean?
I
Right.
mean, what does death mean?
Right.
And for many of us, all these thousands of years later, we're still asking that question.
Yeah, yeah. Now, some people suggest that there was death already, just not of humans, not of Adam and Eve. That maybe they were the first who were granted access to the tree of life. Now, I get it, that's kind of a minority view. That kind of addresses that question for some people. Others, no, this is the first instance of death in existence, and right, like isn't a meaningless word, right? What do you mean we'll die? What's that mean? Yeah, I may have gone, what is this thing? We don't know what it means. Good question, yeah.
I remember as a young Christian, it just contemplating the fact that in the Old Testament, the Israelites, it didn't seem like eternity was preached. It didn't seem like it was a big deal. It didn't seem like it was a big part of their life, eternity. For us, it's huge.
Yeah.
So I just remember how odd it was under the old books. As I would read the Old Testament, they just didn't talk about the afterlife, and yet for us, it's like a fundamental part.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I always thought
It's
that
the
was
reason
odd.
I was baptized. I don't want to go to hell, I want to go to heaven, right? Yeah, and yet you read it and go, what? Yeah.
Yeah. And then when we read that Jesus descended into the lower parts of the earth and set loose a host of captives, that always intrigued me. Intrigued me.
Yeah.
What was going on?
Yeah, so one way I've heard it is, imagine you get in a time machine and you go back to Joshua, and they're mourning Moses, and you say, Joshua, do you think your buddy Moses went to heaven or to hell? Joshua would go, what? What are you talking about? You know, I mean, people, when they die, they go to either heaven or hell. Which do you think you went to? Joshua would go, I don't even know what, your question makes no sense, right? It's so foreign to them. Yeah, it's just not their reality. Yeah. How else does this hit you? In quick, yeah.
I also was just thinking of when Jesus was on the earth
Mhm.
and how, of course, that's this weird in between pivotal point. But now I'm curious about when Moses and Elijah were just, there with him, like,
Mhm.
did he just wake them up? Hey, wake up, come here,
Yeah.
talk with me for a bit. But like, what's going on right now?
Yeah,
I'm thinking that
yeah,
too. So,
yeah. It stirs up a lot of really good questions. I like it, yeah. Anything about this kind of troubling for you? Because if you remember, we talked about, we go from construction to deconstruction. For me, this was like I said, I'd go, that professor didn't know what he's talking about, he's liberal, right? That was how I'd blow off my questions.
While it seems to me that there's not very much in the Old Testament about an afterlife, it seems like there are a few things.
Right?
Seems like maybe Ezekiel
Right.
talks about, maybe it's Ecclesiastes, one of those books, I think.
Yeah.
Who knows that the spirit of man goes upward
Yes.
to heaven and the spirit of the beast goes back down into the earth.
Yes.
Ecclesiastes says
Or God says, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I'm not a God of the dead, but of the living.
Right. But notice he says that in the New Testament.
Was
right?
that the New Testament?
Right.
Okay.
Where kind of gets into it with the Sadducees, if I believe. Because so the reason the Sadducees, their Bible was the first 5 books, the Torah, right? And that was it. Everything after was extra, but it's not the Word of God. I'm sure.
It's not authority.
Okay, yeah, there you go. Good,
Let's-
thank you.
I would
Yes, thank
make
you.
that distinction.
Right,
Authoritative.
right. And so, you go, well, why did the Sadducees not believe in afterlife, resurrection? Because it's not in the Torah. They didn't believe it, right? The Pharisees did because they hold to these later things being authoritative, right? And it does seem that Jesus agrees with the Pharisees. We'll get to that. But the Sadducees, we're just following the Bible and it's not in there. In fact, what's fascinating, I heard it once said, the Sadducees were the conservatives and the Pharisees were the liberals. Whoa, never heard that, right? But right, it does start to pop up in the Old Testament, and we're going to look at that, right? Yeah.
So many of my Jewish friends today, when we talk about things of life, they don't have a concept of eternal condemnation for the reason that you just said. And in the Old Testament of the Torah, I mean, hell is, correct me if I'm wrong, hell is not spoken of.
Uh-huh.
They believe in reward in this life for doing good, and they're very big on that motivation.
Right.
But the flip side of that is it's just not there for them.
Mm-hmm. Right. I would suspect part of it's which branch of modern Judaism, but yeah, right. I would think the conservative branch would hold to this. I assume that it doesn't. And it's just so foreign to us because, like I said, the whole message seems to be, where am I going to spend eternity, right? And they just didn't ask that question. Just wasn't there. That's not what it's about. At least not yet, right? Now, Ecclesiastes comes along, because some of these wise people start to go, wait a second, something's not lining up, okay? So in Ecclesiastes 2, I saw that wisdom is better than folly, just as light is better than darkness. The wise have eyes in their heads, while the fool walks in the darkness. But I came to realize that the same fate overtakes them all. Right? Why be wise anyway? You're just going to end up in Sheol like everybody else. I also said to myself, as for humans, God tests them so that they may see that they are like the animals. Surely the fate of human beings is like that of the animals. The same fate awaits them both. As one dies, so dies the other. All have the same breath. Others say spirit. Humans have no advantage over animals. Everything is meaningless. All go to the same place. All come from dust, and to dust they return. Who knows if the human spirit rises upward and if the spirit of the animal goes down to the earth? We just don't know, right? Then he says, a man may have 100 children and live many years, yet no matter how long he lives, if he cannot enjoy his prosperity and does not receive proper burial, I say that a stillborn child is better off than he. It comes without meaning, it departs in darkness, and in darkness its name is shrouded. Though it never saw the sun or knew anything, it has more rest than does that man. Even if he lives 1,000 years twice over, but fails to enjoy his prosperity, do not all go to the same place? So you hear that despair of, and remember they believe, up to that point, simple retribution. If you do good, good will happen. If you do bad, bad will happen. And he starts to...
Except Ecclesiastes say, that dog don't hunt.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. He's starting to bring in what my professor called realistic retribution. That is, this is generally true, but not always true, right? So think about, I think we would say, or at least I teach my kids, do good, and you'll have a good life, right? And you do bad, bad things will happen. Well, we all know exceptions to that, right? And it leaves us troubled. But we don't go, yeah, that's true, just don't worry about doing good, because it doesn't work anyway, right? We say, generally it does, yeah.
Job takes it one step further.
Yes, yes, yeah.
Job says, here's the perfectly righteous man who's done nothing wrong, and his whole world's going to fall apart.
Yeah.
So, bad things happen to good people,
Mm-hmm.
and it even questions, is God behind it?
Yeah.
Right, it's a...
Yeah. So then we start moving into this area, Job and Ecclesiastes stuff, and people going, I don't know, I buy it, right? You say, God will reward you if you're good, he'll punish you if you're bad, but here's the perfectly good guy, and notice what his friends do. They bring in their theology of simple retribution and say, it must be you, Job. We've reached our conclusion already, now we see reality, so it must be you're the bad guy. So they increase his pain with their theology, right? And so now they're starting to question, this doesn't seem to always hold up, right? Let's see here, where's another? So, there's a strong sense of,
And God did bless Job at the end with, though he doubled his blessing.
Sure, sure.
So, yeah.
yeah.
Still doesn't
Meaning-
take away the fact that he killed all his kids.
Right, right, right. It's like when you say, well, your son died, I'm sorry, you can have another. It doesn't really, right? But I get it, they do try to put a nice bow on the end, but there is still that. So, up to this point, I would say they kind of align with Homer. Now, N.T. Wright will make a big deal, say, don't use the word soul, right? Oh, I'm sorry. Because I still haven't grasped that. Well, the reason is, he says, first of all, it's not the word they use. Sometimes it is. But that when we read that, we read the Greek understanding of soul, okay? But when you die, you die. There may be this kind of, you're alive, but you're not alive spiritually, like Samuel, right?
And if you've ever studied with
Yeah.
Jehovah's Witness,
Uh-huh.
they're stuck, they're right there.
Uh-huh.
They're right there, there's a soul, but they have a hard time with an eternal counterpart.
Uh-huh.
If you've ever studied with Jehovah's Witness.
Yeah.
A lot of the theology is mirrored Hebrew theology.
Yeah, yeah. Which, when I started to learn this, troubled me, because I went, oh, this sounds like Jehovah's Witnesses, so it can't be true, right? Instead of going, well, maybe they saw something, okay? But like I said, what happens is it starts taking this apart. Now, here's why bringing up this question in this class scares me, is if on an emotional, well, theological, but also an emotional level, the reason I'm a Christian is because of the afterlife. And I start pointing out, maybe, I'm sticking with the Old Testament right now, maybe there's not an afterlife. Right? Let's blow up another church, Curtis. Right? Because it is so frightening. Wait, what? You're saying what? Okay. Relax, we're going to get there. But we first have to kind of deconstruct some stuff. And it can really be scary. Yeah.
So, who is the devil and where does he reside? I mean,
Rob will be teaching that class. Right?
it's like, you know,
It's a good question,
something for
right?
40 days, the devil's doing his work. I'm like, okay, so.
Yeah. Yeah, right.
There's somebody in the door somewhere, I'll take door number 3.
Yeah. Well, it's a great question. And actually, when I was wrestling with what to include and not include, this connects with so many different things. Like, what is the gospel? Well, I always thought the gospel was save my eternal soul. And I'm not discounting that, not in any way discounting. But I'm going, oh, maybe I don't even understand the gospel right. In fact, I had a class at Abilene, and I remember going into this class on evangelism. Mark Lowe was teaching. And I'm, all cocky. I'm a doctoral student, right? And we go in this class, and he says, what is the gospel? And I thought, seriously? You're going to waste our time and money to talk about this? We all know what it is. And within a session or two, I was like, I have no idea what the gospel is. I thought I knew, and now I'm saying I don't know what the gospel is, right? Because he was saying, you thought it was this. I'm just telling you, not that all that's wrong, but parts of it are not complete. So, does this leave you disturbed? Anybody? And what about it feels disturbing?
Uncertainty.
Yeah.
I don't know if I'm disturbed about it, but the reality of it, I think, is almost like it's a recipe. In order to make this, you have to have all of these ingredients to come here. So in order to prepare for what are all the pieces?
Uh-huh.
What are all the parts? I need to have all of the information.
Yeah.
And so far, it seems like I only have some of the information, but I want to be able to make a wise choice.
Yes.
And the wise choice is to to do this, but I have to have all of this information
Right.
before I can actually make the wise choice.
Yes.
And the question is, are you going to provide me with all of the information that I need to make the wise choice, which includes definitions of ...
Yes. I
So
will-
it's not just one little thing. There's a lot of
Yeah,
pieces and
I
parts.
will
to
give
it.
you what I can, but I still have a
But that
lot
was
of
just-
questions.
That was the joke.
Oh, I know.
And it got him laughing.
But
But
yeah.
really, there's a lot to know, and how do I know that you're right and
Yeah.
that person is not correct?
Yes.
Because we're all bombarded by different perspectives from many, many people, so who's giving you the?
Yes.
You know,
Great
you
question.
talk about being a good person. What's the measuring stick?
Mhm.
What's the measuring tool to determine whether you're a good person or
Yeah, yeah.
And
Great
two-
questions.
Two things that
Yeah.
have changed in my Christianity in the last few years. Number one, the desire for Christ more than eternity. That's an odd thing.
Mhm. Yes.
It's just like I want my wife more than I want to be married.
Yes.
Marriage brought us together, but over the years, you want her, as you get closer to her, she's become a part of you. You can't imagine Jesus without her. So one thing that God does over time, I think He attracts us with eternity and avoiding hell. That's an early thing, it works very
Yes.
well. But over time, the desire for Jesus, it gets huge, 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 and desire to be with Him.
Yes.
So that's one thing. But the other thing is like in the Hebrew writer, I'm not too disturbed by constructing what the Hebrews thought or what the Greeks thought, because just like when I look at the temple from this side of the cross, we have such a better understanding of the temple than what the Hebrews did,
Mhm.
because that's the
Yeah.
shadow. And so same thing, but when
Yeah.
I think of stuff like this, I'm already looking at it from this side of the cross, what my Lord's taught me. So if I've got some misunderstandings as we approach the cross on that side, I have no problems at all to kind of studying that and trying to figure that
Yeah.
out. And what God chose not to reveal to them, there's a lot of things God didn't reveal to them.
Mhm.
He said they were seeking a city, they didn't know where it was. You know, the Hebrew writer tells us about, there's so many things that Hebrews didn't understand
Mhm.
that's now been revealed to us. So
Yeah, yeah.
part of this is, I'm
Yeah.
very comfortable.
Yeah, okay, cool. Yeah, if you remember the first session I talked about when I worked at the car lot and the mechanics would have a bench full of leftover bolts and stuff. And I was like, that's not good. You rebuild an engine, you got leftover parts. I'm no mechanic, and so much of my theology was that way. I had all these scriptures that didn't fit because I started with the assumption man has an immortal soul and that's what counts. And so you're left with all this stuff, right? That when you get this other view, you go, oh, now those scriptures are starting to fit. Now, I'll admit I still got some leftover parts, and I still listen to N.T. Wright quite a bit to try to learn more. In fact, let me tell you about something that happened recently. Maybe I'll wrap up with this. So last week, after class, Rob and I were talking, and he said, did you notice that Genesis 3, it said God put a cherubim to guard the way to the tree of life? You read the word angel. Right there on the screen it said cherubim, and when I read it, my mind went, and he put an angel, right? It's so ingrained in us that even when the word is in front of us, we don't even see it, right? And that's what can happen in our understanding. It's so ingrained that when we read scripture, we think it must mean immortal soul. We don't think because Plato taught us that, but it got passed down. Okay, so this week, I'm going for a walk, and I'm listening to an N.T. Wright thing. And he's talking about Genesis 3. And N.T. Wright said, when God put an angel to protect the way to the planet. No, he didn't. No, he didn't. Right? That if a guy as scholarly as N.T. Wright still reads into the scripture something that's not there, I know I'm going to. Right?
What is a cherub?
Yeah. Well, describe it.
It's not a fat angel baby.
Right. Right.
It's a sphinx.
Yeah. It's a different creature entirely. Right?
Like the angel of death.
Yeah.
never mentions an angel.
But it's so fascinating that I could read the word on the screen and transpose in, right? So here's an analogy I thought of. I hope this works. Think of old Polaroids or Kodak pictures and you go get it printed, right? Versus digital. You have the paper and you have the image that's on the paper. Okay? And I think Homer would say, when the paper disintegrates, so does the image. It no longer exists. Now you might be able to kind of see bits of it, right? Where Plato would think digitally, right? You can have an image on a digital screen, but if the digital screen, you break your phone, the image isn't gone, it's uploaded in the cloud. So it still exists. And so the image lasts forever in spite of the material stuff. Right?
There is no cloud.
Right. And the Israelites would have said, what cloud are you talking about? Right?
Yeah, when the data center goes down, it's all over.
Yes. Yes. Right? Right? Yeah. So, I want you just to wrestle with that. Now, okay, so next week, I'm out, and my understanding is nobody's available. And so what I'm going to do this week is I am going to video me teaching this. And if y'all can put up with the boredom of watching a video, I'll try to make it interactive somehow. We'll do that for next week's lesson, okay? I'm going to be in Florida. I had a client this week, and he just got back from a trip to Florida, to the beach we're going to. And he starts telling me, hey, man, you wouldn't believe these sharks I saw. And he starts telling the story. I don't know if you heard about all the shark attacks. And then it's like, how did you deal with that? I'm thinking, call Karen, we're not going. All right, so go enjoy this life, right? And we'll talk about the next one later.
You're teaching a class on death, so don't be